Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here. Community members, parents, a mix of everything here, students. My name is Krista Campbell. I work in the advancement office here at the college. And we do these talks about once a month during the school year. We do 6 a year. So we're really happy to have you here. And Aaron Strong is going to tell you a little bit about himself, and I will let him take it away.
Thanks so much, Krista. Thank you all for being here today, especially on this gorgeous final day of official summer. This is a really nice time to do this because it's Parents' Weekend. So we have folks from the community here, and we also have parents and students here, and that's really wonderful. It's a really nice time to talk about this also because we've been doing a lot of work at Hamilton on our climate action plans over the last few years. We finalized a series of updates just last year. So it's a nice time to sort of share that more broadly with the community, especially through the Arboretum, just given how much is taking place out in our forested lands on campus. My name is Aaron Strong. I'm an associate professor of environmental studies and the director of the environmental studies program here. So that means I just got tenure, and I work on climate action research writ large. So by training, I'm a soil carbon and carbon cycle biogeochemist and global change ecologist, but I've been working on climate policy topics for a long time. Here at the college, so I'm at Hamilton. Here at the college, I teach courses on climate change, renewable energy systems, climate risk and resilience, and our introduction to environmental studies course as well. And I see several of my students here with your parents, so thanks for bringing them here. I absolutely love working at Hamilton. This is a total dream job, and I think you'll see why as we walk through this, because of all the opportunities that we have to work with students doing hands-on real work that's part of guiding what our future looks like. And because we have an open curriculum here, and everyone talks about that from the student's perspective, know thyself, study what you love. But from the faculty perspective, it's you get to teach what you want and what you think is the most important. So the open curriculum is really nice for faculty too. And I just wanted to plug that as well. What's it?
Are you muted on the podium?
Yep.
Okay.
Not on this. This is on, okay. But this is fine. So just a quick outline. I'm going to set the scene by talking about the climate action imperative. This is not actually about Hamilton at first. We're going to talk about climate change, global perspective. Why do we need to reduce emissions? Then I'm going to talk about Hamilton College's own greenhouse gas emissions, our emissions inventory, and talk about what we're doing about it at Hamilton through 4 components of our climate action plan. I'll speak a little bit at the end about waste reduction and landfill diversion, which is a new area and a new commitment that we've made. And there's a lot of work that's starting out on that. So I'm not going to talk a whole lot about it, but I want to sort of plug that there's several things that we can do in that regard. Okay. I want everyone to take a deep breath. So the breath that you just breathed in is measurably different than the breath you breathed in when you were first born. There is a lot more carbon dioxide in it. Out in the atmosphere, there's about 426 parts per million carbon dioxide. When our students were born, our graduating seniors were born, there were 373 parts per million carbon dioxide. When I was born, there were 340 parts per million carbon dioxide. And in 1800, there were 280 parts per million carbon dioxide. We can't see it, but this accumulation of greenhouse gases is continuing in the atmosphere. And of course, this is all part of what we can think of as the Great Acceleration, sometimes called the Anthropocene. This era of time in which all of these curves, and it doesn't matter what's written up here, are going up, 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 right? Species extinction rate, human population, the amount of nutrient pollution, the amount of plastic pollution, the amount of carbon dioxide going in the atmosphere, all of this is going up. And in this room, we have several generations of humans. And what I want to convey to you, if you take nothing else away from today, is that each of you is part of one of about 7 generations of humans that will ever experience these rates of change on this planet. because we know that these curves can't continue to go up forever. We know that some of them are starting to slow down. Population growth is slowing down. We're going to hit a flat level of about 9-ish billion people by the middle of this century, such that some countries are talking about worrying about not having enough children. We know that not all these can go up forever because resources are finite. And we also know that they can't go up forever because if we continue to put CO2 in the atmosphere, this planet will become much harder to live on. I don't want to say unlivable, just much harder to live on. So I frame this because the decisions that we make in our lives, but also as societies right now, shape the trajectory of the Anthropocene. In other words, we're here at this key point, and we know that these curves won't go on going up forever. So how do we guide them to a good landing place? That's the challenge of sustainability, right? How do we guide them so that we don't have hundreds of millions of people dying from famine? And I find this incredibly motivating in all the teaching that I do, because this wasn't the case in the past in humanity, and it won't be the case in the future. So we're one of the lucky 7 generations that will ever experience these rates of change. It's a tough charge that we all have. Okay. Now I want everyone to take one more deep breath and breathe out. What's one of the gases that you breathed out?
Carbon dioxide.
Carbon dioxide. So did you, when you breathed out, did you contribute to this rise, this wiggle jiggle going up? Where are you part of the problem? What about when I do this? So what's one of the gases coming off of this flame? Carbon dioxide. So I will contend to you that when you breathe out, you are not part of the problem. But when I do this, I am part of the problem. And here's why. The carbon dioxide that you breathe out was recently in the atmosphere. It got into your body through the food that you ate. And how did it get in that food? Well, through photosynthesis, right? So the carbon dioxide's in the atmosphere, and plants photosynthesize. They take that carbon and they make starches and sugars. And even if you do eat meat, then you're still eating the carbon that was in the animal that was in the plant before that. So when you breathe out, you are not accumulating new carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. But when I do this and I take a fossil fuel, which is what's in this lighter, I am adding new CO2 to the atmosphere because the carbon that I'm burning wasn't recently in the atmosphere. Okay, wasn't recently in the atmosphere. These chemical reactions in our bodies and what I'm doing here are actually almost identical. We call this respiration, mixing a hydrocarbon with oxygen to get energy out of it and producing CO2. And we call this one combustion. But they're the same chemical reaction. The difference is that one of them accumulates carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So it's not all people burning lighters, right? Where does most of the CO2 in the atmosphere come from? Most of it comes from these 3 sources: transportation, burning gasoline in cars, heating our buildings through furnaces that run on oil or natural gas, and making electricity by burning things like coal and natural gas. In New York State, these 3 sources account for 90% of our greenhouse gas emissions. But wait, isn't deforestation part of the problem too, right? I thought deforestation contributed to climate change. And I just told you that because photosynthesis, it just came into the plant, we ate the plant. So why would cutting down these trees matter? Well, emissions from deforestation, we have to think about the difference between what a tree's doing on a daily basis and the accumulation of carbon in a forest. So here's what happens with the tree. Carbon dioxide comes into the tree as it's growing through photosynthesis. And trees, of course, produce oxygen through that process. They use some of the sugars they make metabolically. You know, trees actually breathe out CO2, but we're not worried about that CO2. This is just like us, right? This looks just like us. A tree is an organism like us. But about 50% of the weight of a tree is carbon. 50% of the mass of a tree is carbon. And that carbon in a forest is sitting there for a long time. So if you cut down, burn, or chop up that forest, that carbon is getting converted to CO2. And that makes it a lot more like the fossil fuel. So how long does it have to be out of the atmosphere for it to count, right? Like it needs to have not been in the atmosphere recently. Scientists have come up with a number, 100 years. So when we try to take carbon out of the atmosphere and store it in trees, we have to do that for 100 years. And forests last a long time. Yes, some of the trees die, but overall, a forest is holding a lot of carbon there. And if we cut it down and convert it to not forest, that carbon's going in the atmosphere and it's staying in the atmosphere. And that's why it too is a source of greenhouse gas emissions. Globally, this is about 2/3 of the problem. And about another 10% of the problem is deforestation, forestry, and other land use. The rest of it is from other gases like methane and nitrous oxide. Methane comes from things like leaky natural gas pipes and cows burping it out, and landfills. We'll come back to that later because there's some opportunities that methane provides. So what happens? All of these gases go in the atmosphere. We get more and more and more of it because we are doing more deforestation and because we are doing more of this. And these gases act like blankets in the atmosphere, trapping the Earth's body heat. That's the best analogy I can come up with. The more greenhouse gases you have in the atmosphere, the more of the Earth's own body heat is being trapped, just like a blanket. So I know we call them greenhouse gases, but I like to call them blanket gases. You need some of them. If we had no greenhouse gases, the Earth would be an ice ball. We need some. Just like you probably want a blanket on your bed. It's nice. But on a hot summer day, do you want to keep putting more and more and more blankets on? You're going to start to overheat. That's exactly what's happening on this planet. Last month was the 546th consecutive month where global temperatures were above the 20th century average. In the last week of July, it was the hottest day in human history that we just lived through. And we know the solutions to this. We need to stop doing this. Now, that's hard to do because our energy system runs on this, right? So this is not an immediate overnight process. We can't just immediately replace all fossil fuels. But if we electrify heating and transportation, and we power that with 100% zero carbon electricity, then we have a shot. Welcome, good to see you. So in order to take effective action on climate change, we have to reduce emissions from 40 billion tons where they are now to net zero by 2050, all right? Why? Well, this is the number that we need to do in order to avoid 1.5 degrees of warming. And this is why you see a whole lot of commitments out there to net zero emissions. This is the end of my initial framing. So now I'm going to talk about Hamilton. All right. So there's an imperative to drop emissions in order to avoid catastrophic climate change. And we have to do that by removing our sources of fossil fuels. In 2007, if you can remember that year, at the time, Hamilton President Joan Hines Stewart signed the American College and University President's Climate Commitment. And so did a lot of other college presidents. And at the time, let's set the stage of what it was like in 2007. Hurricane Katrina had happened a year and a half before. There was an awareness that the manifestations of climate change were dangerous. At the global scale, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released a big report that got caught up in the news that basically said humans are unequivocally warming the planet. This is also the year that Al Gore's movie came out, and he was a speaker going all around talking about inconvenient truth. It was the end of the George W. Bush administration in the United States, or getting close to it, right? There was an election in 2008. So there was a sense that now was the time to figure out what our responsibility was to reduce emissions. The Kyoto Protocol had not worked. There had been very little action on climate change of any kind. So colleges and universities said, you know, we ought to lead. We ought to lead and show that this can be done. So they made a commitment to get rid of their emissions, but they had no idea how to do that. And so they put this date, most of them, as this was the date by which we're going to get rid of our emissions. Flash forward 10 years. Some colleges have started to take action on this, but the science has advanced. This figure I showed you before, it came out in 2018, so 11 years later. And it said, everybody needs to get to net zero by 2050. Unilever Corporation, PepsiCo, every country on the planet. And all of a sudden, 2050 looks like you're just par for the course. And that's true. The science changed from 2007, where making any commitment to go carbon neutral was substantive, to 2018, where carbon neutral by 2050 is just what the science says everybody needs to do. So you're just playing along. And the entire point of the American College and University President's climate commitment was that we need to lead. We need to show that this can be done. It's also the year that I came to Hamilton and we started a new sustainability working group that basically took everything that I've showed you so far here between administrators, facilities, students, faculty, and said, what are we going to do about this here, right? We are now in a place where 2050 looks like we're not leading, we're just following. We're also in a place where we need to take real action, but we're also in a place where we can start to reduce our emissions. The work of that sustainability working group, working closely with the Board of Trustees and President David Whitman, led to a new pledge that Hamilton College would go carbon neutral by 2030, which, if you check the calendar, is like 5 years from now, right? Why? Why 2030? And I'll talk about carbon neutrality in a second, but carbon neutrality means that you have no net increase in CO2 to the atmosphere, right? So we can still breathe out and be carbon neutral. I convince you of that, right? But if we do some of this, still, we need to equivalently be removing that somehow. So carbon neutrality does not mean fully getting rid of all greenhouse gas emissions, all blanket gas emissions. It means that there's no net accumulation from the activities of this institution in terms of the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. That rising squiggle line that's been going on for a long time is not something that we're contributing to. And I'm very proud that in 2022, the Board of Trustees adopted a resolution to advance our carbon neutrality date from 2050 to 2030 at Hamilton College. And they also said a few other things in that process, and those other things are probably even more important. The first was do real things. And what I mean by that is, if you look at other institutions, corporations, et cetera, that have gone carbon neutral, they don't do a lot of reducing this. They do a lot of paying other people to take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, something called offsets. There were, in fact, carbon neutral universities in 2020 that literally had their emissions on campus go up, but they just paid for it. So the Board of Trustees was very clear. We are going to start by doing real things to reduce our emissions, real things to take CO2 out of the atmosphere. The second was, we are an educational institution. And if we have budget lines associated with this, it's got to serve the educational mission. And so involving students in every step of this process is something that we need to put front and center. And I think you'll see that for the rest of the talk that I'm going to give. Involving students is not just about having hands-on experiences here. It's also about preparing students for a future in which every single one of you is going to be thinking about climate change and dealing with carbon accounting and dealing with renewable energy and dealing with electrification and trying to understand and make sense of all of this. This is part of our world now, and it will be for the rest of our students' lives, right? So we better train people to navigate this. Like, it is another thing about life. There's, sort of finance, there's art, culture, literature, there's politics. You don't have to study all of those. We're not requiring everyone to study this. We have an open curriculum, but this is another big part of life where a lot of attention is being focused. So we ought to train our students in that regard as well. Okay, so I'm now going to talk about Hamilton College's greenhouse gas emissions. I want to start with a question, just get some ideas from this lovely audience we have today. What do you think is Hamilton's biggest source of greenhouse gas emissions? What do we do here that produces the most CO2 going into the atmosphere? You guys are great. By far. By far. 60+% of our emissions are from burning natural gas to heat our buildings. So one of the tricky things when we started looking at these plans at Hamilton is that many other colleges have one big central plant like that produces steam that can go in and heat all the buildings. And if you change that plant out, that heating plant out to something that's burning biofuels is often one of the solutions instead of burning fossil fuels, then you can hit most of the heating at once. Hamilton College has 30 some odd buildings plus a bunch of other smaller buildings. Almost all of them run on natural gas. There's a few very small buildings that have oil heat, and the dark side was electric in the inefficient old electric heating. So there's some things over there. But we've got a situation where almost every building is operating completely independently. And so in order to tackle these, we got to go building by building, and you'll see that in a second. Great. So yeah, almost all of our emissions are from burning fossil fuels to heat buildings. I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this figure. This is our most recent greenhouse gas emissions inventory, and I think it's helpful to see and understand. Okay. First impression, emissions are going down. Great. This is 2007 when we made the commitment to 2023. Okay. Why are they going down? Well, let's start by looking at these three scopes of emissions. So this is done in carbon accounting. We divide emissions into 3 different categories. Scope 1 is everything where we're burning fossil fuels on campus. So that's in our vehicles, transportation vehicles, Hamilton-owned vans, and in heating our buildings. That's the dark blue. Scope 2 is the purchased electricity to light all of these buildings, right? So we're buying electricity from the New York State grid, and that electricity that we purchase carries with it emissions because there are fossil fuels in the New York State grid. Scope 3 are emissions associated with things like travel and mostly from travel. They're off-site emissions that are taking place elsewhere. Okay, so if we look at the numbers in 2007 and the numbers in 2023, what do we notice? Scope 2 emissions have dropped a lot.
Nothing to do with that.
And what Chuck just said is nothing to do with Hamilton. That's true. I mean, we're making a decision to buy electricity. But the New York State grid is getting greener really quickly. And that's accelerating because New York just passed in 2019 and now implemented in 2022, one of the most ambitious climate targets in the country. And notably by 2040, New York State has to have carbon-free electricity. And that requires an enormous amount of new renewable energy, something I work on in my research. Now, we don't have offshore wind yet, but there are plans for it, but we have a lot of solar farms that are being built. We also have a lot of hydro and nuclear on our grid. We have one of the cleanest grids in the country. So going back to our emissions inventory, most of this reduction is due to buying greener electricity. That doesn't really feel like a big accomplishment. I'm going to be honest. And when we were socializing this with the board of trustees, right, and across the campus, we needed to be honest about this, because you can put up this figure and not explain it and say, look how great we are. We've cut our emissions by like 30-something%. Go team. Now, we have done some real things. Look at the scope 1 line, 7,200, 6,500. We've done that while adding new buildings that have to be heated. So that is real. It's been through energy efficiency. It's been through the use of more efficient heating systems that I'll talk about in a second. Now, the next thing I want you to see is down here, there's something called RECs and forest carbon. And you'll see the forest carbon accounting starts with some emissions and then goes negative. We're going to spend a lot of time over the next half hour talking about that. RECs are these things called renewable energy certificates. I'm happy to talk about them. They're somewhat problematic if you basically, they're these certificates you can trade to say, we bought renewable power, but we're not actually buying renewable power. We're just buying a certificate that someone else sold. And it's kind of like an offset. It certainly doesn't fall under the category of doing real things, right, on campus with students. And so we've stopped that process since 2018. Okay, so here we are. We have 7,600 net tons of emissions, about 10,000 actual tons of emissions, and we got a few years to get to neutrality to do our part. So what is this going to look like? Let's talk about these 4 bullets of climate action at Hamilton. And these are the 4 pillars of our climate action plan, which is on the sustainability website. It's a PDF you can download and take a look at the 2023 plan that's been put together. The first, doing real things, is replace fossil fuel infrastructure in our buildings. Invest in energy upgrades to buildings to reduce reliance on fossil fuels for building heating, primarily through expanded use of ground source and air source heat pumps, powered on electricity from a grid that continues to become greener. The second is to sequester carbon in our forests. The third is to take a look at some of our other sources of emissions. It may be 60-some-odd% from heating buildings, but there's still the rest of it. And we need to take a look at solutions there, particularly around transportation, because that's one of the other big ones. And fourth, we need to have a plan of, are we going to use offsets and in what way and under what principles? Okay, so this is what it's like to put together a climate action plan. This was done with groups and groups of students, faculty, staff, presentations to the community, getting input from the community over the process from about 2020 to 2022. So during those years, a lot of it was on Zoom because of that, which I lament because I think it was harder to really, no offense to those of you who are joining on Zoom, thank you for being here. But it was hard to build community. So what does it look like in our plans to remove fossil fuels from buildings? What we've been doing so far is, as we renovate buildings, certainly as we build new buildings, and there's one coming right over there that you can already see the starts of. But as we renovate our buildings, we need to rip out the fossil fuel infrastructure and replace it with ground source heat pumps. And this is a tremendous opportunity. So that's exactly what we've been doing. Most recently in the Root Hall renovation, if any of you are returning to campus or haven't seen the new Root Hall, it's just a few doors down across on the green in front of the Science Center. So that building has a whole series of deep geothermal wells that are dug. And it's actually the 7th one of our buildings out of about 30 total that has these geothermal heating systems. I wish there was a giant picture of this to show everybody, but they're underground. So this is one of the challenges, actually, right? That this biggest thing we've been doing, this real thing we've been doing, it's buried underground, because what it does is actually use a fluid to condense the heat that you extract from the land and throw that heat into the building. It's like an air conditioner in reverse. It's a wonderful technology and it's powered by electricity. And you can have a really warm, comfortable space. You can also air condition the building. So one of the cool win-wins here is that for those of you who don't know, there's not a lot of air conditioning in most of the buildings at Hamilton College. And if you also saw everything I talked about for the first 15 minutes, it's getting warmer here, right? And especially in August when students come back to campus, it's very warm in dorms, unpleasantly warm in dorms. And as we put these systems in, we can cool the buildings with those same heat pumps. You just operate them in reverse. You suck the heat out of the building and you put it underground. And that's great. It's incredible. So we have more to do. The price tag of doing this all at once was very high. The price tag of doing it gradually, especially with new tax incentives and as the technology gets better, is lower. And we're continuing to do this work as we both build new buildings and renovate our older buildings. This has involved students. Just an example, I had a student do a final research paper in a course all about our building heatings, and particularly why in the winter sometimes students are opening their dorm windows because the buildings are overheated and what to do about that. And then how to understand what's taking place in our building systems, because a lot of students aren't aware of any of this happening. And she then took that paper that she wrote in a class, met with facilities throughout it, and turned it into an article that went into one of our student newspapers, right? And she's continued to build and work on this. And now it's much more of a conversation. Next week, there's a facilitated student conversation about the finer elements of this climate action plan and how students can think about it and receive it. So it's both being brought into the classroom in different ways. Our geoscience courses are going out when they drill these wells and understanding like, how do you actually drill down 400 feet and put in a geothermal well, right? Like that's not the easiest thing to understand. We're baking it into the classroom. Okay. We're now going to talk, and since this is an Arboretum sponsored event, I did want to spend most of the time talking about what's going on in the land and in the forest. It's not the only part of our climate action plan. There's three things that we're doing here, and you can see students involved in putting tree tubes around planted trees in one of our reforestation sites. So one, we're managing our existing forested lands to sequester carbon. We're trying to figure out ways to improve that sequestration. We're documenting that sequestration, and we're making particular assumptions about it that I want to be clear about. The next is that we are reforesting some of the 150 acres of open lands on Hamilton's campus, much of it former agricultural land. And the third is that we're working with students to measure soil carbon. So not the carbon stored in trees, but the accumulation of carbon in the soils when you convert from an agricultural field to a forest. And that's a really cool science project. There's posters about it upstairs right now. So we'll talk about each of these three things next, and then keep going. Okay, Hamilton owns a fair amount of land. The overall campus is about 1,300 acres. About 800 of that is currently forested. Now, much of this is secondary forest that's regrown from former agricultural fields that were donated to the college or that the college purchased and in which agriculture no longer took place. And as you can see on this figure, you know, for those of you who spend time on campus, you might like walking in the Root Glen or in Kirkland Glen on the loop on the backside of the rugby fields. Some of you might like walking in Rogers Glen, which are those RO plots up there. And a few of you may have been out to the reservoir property which goes all the way up to Skyline on College Hill Road. It's not contiguous with the rest of campus, but we have 200 some odd acres up there. That was actually a pine forest plantation planted around 3 dug reservoirs that were the water source for the college for many years. There's still a big water tank out there as an emergency backup water supply, and those ponds are still out there, and the forest around them is still out there. It was also a source of firewood for students when they had to heat their dorms with a biofuel known as wood. So these forests are growing. They haven't fully matured. Now, how do we recognize the accumulation of carbon in these forests? Well, we made a decision to change how we do carbon accounting. The first thing that we said is if we clear any forests or trees on campus, we now have to count those emissions, right? Because we're emitting, remember I talked about the carbon cycle earlier, and you cut down a forest and it's a source of emissions to the atmosphere. But look at this map and look at the land around Hamilton. Is most of it forest? No. It's what Hamilton's land was before Hamilton got it or purchased it and decided to let it become forest, to manage it to be forest. Most of it was cleared. Much of it, relatively recently, over the last few decades, was still open land. So what we recognize is it's not responsible to say all of this carbon, right? All of the carbon that the trees are sucking out of the atmosphere as they grow, that's because of us. But it's also not fair to say that none of it is because of us, because if Hamilton College didn't exist, much of this land would be cleared and would look like the rest of the landscape. And so what we did was a geospatial analysis to look at how unique is the set of things around Hamilton. Now, the creeks, people didn't really farm right along the creeks. You'd have forest along the creeks. You can see that here, right? But most of the other usable land was open. And so we have a sort of additionality deductor is what we call it. What that means is we basically spatially account for how much more forest does Hamilton's land have on it than would have otherwise happened without Hamilton College being here. But we don't say all the carbon in those trees is part of our emissions reductions. We just say what we accumulate each new year by maintaining those forests is what we should count as our sequestration. This is a long process involving lots of stakeholder conversations. And what we found is that the Rogers Forest, which is shown in this map as RO towards the top, sequesters about 1,000 tons of CO2 per year. The Kirkland Forest, which is lovely on the backside of the rugby field, sequesters about 1,164 tons per year. The North Central Forest only sequesters about 174 tons, much lower on a per acre, 2.6 versus almost 5. Why is it so much worse? Well, this North Central Forest is the forest, you can see it kind of up there in that NC, all of that land. It's mostly buckthorn. It's low invasive trees. Right. So one of the things that we're working on, and we've had several research projects with students, is you have an invaded forest that's not sequestering as much carbon as it would be if it were a native hardwood forest with maples and cherries. So how can we change it? Now, anyone who's worked with buckthorn knows it's tough. Right? You cut it down, 100 plants grow up where you cut it down. Right? You cover those. They escape their covers. I know this because we did it. Buckthorn is a beast. But we have students continuing to work on trying to figure out, we have this low carbon value invaded forest that we can try to convert to a healthier forest. There are maple seedlings in there. There are also ash seedlings, but the future of ash trees right now is not so great. So we're working on that to try to improve the carbon sequestration rates of our forests, while also recognizing that by preserving these forest lands, we will continue this sequestration. Now, one of the effects of this is there's actually never been a conservation or protection of these large tracts of forests. The college could say, we want to be like Tufts and build a medical school, and there goes the forest. It's not going to say that, but this actually bakes in a form of protection because it's now part of our land and forest stewardship plan. And within that plan, two things. One, in order to achieve our carbon goals, we need these forests. And if we cut them all down, we'll lose the future sequestration and we'll emit all that carbon in the atmosphere. And two, we have a plan to conserve these forests now that's been codified and adopted. And so that's one of the things that's come out of this process is actually a conservation plan for the 800 acres of existing forest outside the root glen and the Arboretum, the rest of the forest. that it will be conserved into the future for its carbon value amongst other things. Okay. What about reforestation? Well, since 2018, we have planted close to 3,000 trees in former agricultural lands. Tracks 8A and 8B are in green along the golf course here and here. That was in 2018 and 2019, about 800 trees, which were not planted in tubes and were planted by students. In tract 11, which is the 17-acre plot in the middle surrounded by the Rogers Glen Forest, we've planted over 1,000 trees in tubes, half within 8-foot tall installed deer fencing. Those were also planted by students, including several hundred planted during senior week of 2022. And one of the lessons learned is that seniors during their final week of college are not the best people to plant trees in the morning. Learning from that, in 2023 at tract 6, which is over here by Rogers Estate, this small narrow thing, we've actually planted 1,600 trees in tubes, as well as 1,600 trees and shrubs, I should say. This has been an adaptive process that students have been involved in. It's really cool because groups of faculty have been figuring out which tree species, which mix of shrubs should we try this in and out of the deer fence? What are the survival rates of different kinds of tree species? You know, why does it work here and not here? So there's been ongoing active summer research projects between biology and environmental studies students, as well as committees making decisions, literally looking at lists of trees and saying, let's buy these and not these, let's buy these and not these. This last round was professionally planted. Mostly this has been a hardwood and conifer mix, different iterations in different locations, sugar maples, silver maples, cherries, red oaks, willows, white spruce, white pines, dogwoods, redbuds, pawpaws. We've had long debates about what species, you know, should we plant trees that we think will do well in the future climate? Which hard lines do we draw on different natives? And we did plant some sycamores in the original golf course reforestation plot. So what have we learned? Here you can see a maple coming out of, coming out of one of the tree tubes. We need to tube these trees. We need to, because they're these giant rat-like things, which we call deer, that are all around here. So 2018, 2019, we planted just a few acres with 800 trees planted by students with no tree tubes. We revisited that this summer. Out of the 800 some odd trees we planted, only 27 are still alive. That mortality rate is 96.6%. And the only trees that are survived are sycamores and spruces. And for those of you who are here for the Arboretum part of the talk, the future forest that we're trying to make is not a sycamore spruce forest. That's not like a thing. That's not a forest type that we're going for. So we learned tree tubes need to be installed correctly. If they aren't staked down, the wind and the winter will blow them over. Or the bottom will not be protected from predation, not by our giant rat-like things called deer, but our smaller rat-like things called rodents will acidly nibble the bottoms of the trees. And then the trees need to be planted with the roots down, which was a big problem with those students in 2022, not upside down. So if you do this well with students who are trained and have a protocol, and you put down a weed mat and you hammer in a stake to hold and secure the tube, the trees can grow well. And the mortality rate is much lower. We're still working on exactly crunching the numbers. Part of that is that if we can get above 60% survival, there are a series of new DEC, New York State reforestation grants that basically we can show we're doing this and we can get a lot of support and money. So we've had folks from DEC's reforestation arm come out here. They are super excited about what we're doing, despite all the mishaps earlier going on, for a couple of reasons. One, New York State's climate law includes a big push on reforestation. And there are not a lot of big institutional partners that they're working with. There's a land trust and us, which are the only ones doing above 20 acres of active reforestation. Plenty are letting their fields go. Plenty are managing their forests, but relatively few institutional landowners are actually taking open land and saying, we want to put a good forest here. Now we could just do nothing on the land, right? And it would become forest, but you know what it would become? That crappy buckthorn forest that doesn't sequester much carbon and is full of invasives. That's what it would, that is what would happen if we weren't the ones managing this. All right. So the other thing we've learned is that deer fencing takes a lot of work to maintain. It's not as simple as you put up the fence and it's good. Why? Because winter happens and stuff happens. So regularly going out and mending the fence, and it's that great feeling of like, hey, we're working the land, we're mending our fences. So mending the fence is important. But we also have planted almost half of the trees outside of the deer fences, and they're doing just fine. So the tubes are the really critical element here for us. Not necessarily the deer fencing, but it gives us some good experimental designs, right, for students in ecology classes to understand how much of a difference does the deer fencing make. And you can look at many other questions that aren't about trees. The latest round was professionally planted, but the contract didn't execute until they planted in December, upon which it iced and snowed the day after all the trees were put in. But they held to their contract and they actually replaced this spring the trees that were lost to mortality from. Just December is not a great time to plant. Learn that too. But this tract is doing very well. It's over by Rogers Estate. There's still quite a bit of student labor involved in installing weed mats, which took place throughout the summer, even with the professional planting. But these trees are all really thriving. So this has been exciting. And what's next is trying, so we've number 6 here, number 11, and a big chunk of 8A and a little chunk of 8B have all been planted. We're going to redo these because of these had a few tubes, but there were no tubes in 8A. But there's a lot of other land. The blue indicates that at the time of the climate action plan, it was in an active agricultural lease. And the green is not in an active agricultural lease. The next target is number 5 on Rogers Estate. And we're going to keep learning and keep going. So the thing I love about this is it's a collaborative, adaptive process that involves students extensively in intensive summer research and our courses, involving staff, grounds crew, and faculty to make these decisions. Now working with the Department of Environmental Conservation, the New York DEC, to secure additional grants to do this. And this is what the real world of doing land management looks like. Conversations about restoration ecology, which should we plant, how should we do it, learning from our mistakes. This is what the real world of reforestation looks like. And it's been a great experience so far, and it's going to continue. One of the things that we're just starting to work on is measuring soil carbon as we convert from former agricultural lands to meadows and then forest. Carbon will accumulate in soils, not just trees. And we're measuring this conversion by looking at the percent carbon stored. But for those of you who are interested in plant biology, corn is a C4 crop, and it has a different signature in its stable isotopes of carbon, not radioactive, stable isotopes of carbon in corn. And so the soil in a cornfield is like measurably different in its isotopes from a forest. And because we have former cornfields that are being abandoned from corn, we can look at the year to year, like how rapidly is new carbon coming in? And that's what we've been doing here with Dana and Carson from a few years ago, and now with a student, Quinn Perkins, who I worked with this summer. And for those of you parents in the room, Dana's doing a PhD in soil and crop science at Cornell, and Carson is working for a renewable energy company looking at solar deployment. So they're both using their degrees and doing awesome, cool science and climate work. So just a plug for that. Some fresh data from last week. Tract 11, which has been abandoned from agriculture for 4 years, has about 1.9% carbon, and Tract 5, which was in corn was agriculturally planted and has not been reforested or converted from agriculture at all yet, has 0.9% carbon. So preliminary, I'm not making any claims about this yet, but that's exciting to see. That's super exciting to see. Okay, I want to talk about a few more parts of our climate action plan and then open to questions and wrap up in just the next few minutes. So a lot of things going on in our lands, a lot of work removing fossil fuel infrastructure from buildings. In terms of our other emissions, our big focus has been on vehicles. The electrification of Hamilton's vehicle fleet is underway with a purchase of a series of new plug-in hybrid minivans and then full electric vehicles, particularly some of the more smaller utility vehicles. This is something that Mike Klappmeyer, our new facilities manager, has been really championing, and it's happening now and quickly. We also have 20 charge points installed on campus. Those were malfunctioning for a while because the company that first installed them was not one of the winners in the grand scheme of who's going to make the chargers that work. So we replaced them with a new set of chargers that are much better and working great. By 2027, we want to have a full plan for what the future of electrification of transportation on Hamilton looks like. Because what we're going to see is more and more and more student vehicles on campus that need to be charged, more and more faculty vehicles that need to be charged, right? So how do we set up not 20 charge points, but a different network of charge points? But we're not waiting till 2027 to make that plan. We've installed a bunch already, and we have all these new vehicle purchases are being electrified, and this will reduce that chunk of our emissions associated with transportation. So what about using offsets? I sort of started by telling you that offsets are bad because they don't involve doing real things. Just paying someone else to, you could pay someone else to plant trees in another part of the world and say we're doing our part by doing that and do nothing on campus. And to us, that doesn't feel right because we want it to be real here, students involved. That makes more sense. But the truth is that in 2030, we may have some sources of emissions that are hard to get rid of. It's not clear that by 2030, all airline travel or bus travel that the college pays for will be decarbonized. I think most of us can imagine that sports teams are in buses that are not all, going to Colby for a hockey game is going to be a tough thing to do with an electric bus in the next few years. It's probably going to happen in the next 10 to 15 years, but doing it in the next 5 may not. So what about offsets? They will only be used as a last resort. They must be permanent, additional, real, and verifiable. And they have to be mission-driven and local, meaning we have to have students involved in the project for the offset. And that is unique from our peer institutions. Because that principle means it's furthering the educational mission, and then we're not outsourcing this to someone else to do it. So what are some of the options? Working with dairy farms to capture methane with biodigesters. We have a dairy farm up the hill. Those of you who spend time up here.
With what?
To capture methane with a biodigester. So that's a system for capturing the methane gas from the manure pits. It has an added benefit, which really helps sell some of that this could be an idea of working for the college. I don't know if you've noticed, but at certain times of year on the hill, it smells like manure. So you can get rid of that smell with one of these things that also lowers the methane. Working with landfills to capture the methane coming from landfills, and then working with other forested land. Thank you. We don't know what we're going to choose yet, but we want to get students involved. And 3 days ago, that process started, and it's actually being spearheaded by a group of student athletes who want to focus on the emissions associated with their transportation, right? With the buses that are going to all these athletes. So this was a meeting between the men's hockey team and a few other student athlete groups and the Hamilton sustainability coordinators. To start talking about what are our plans to do at this intersection so that students can get involved with doing something real that feels more like service and education than it does like buying an indulgence, right? which is often how offsets are conceived. Okay. This all sounds good. I think it's awesome. And I think it's a really big testament to the way Hamilton operates to do these things. But I also authored a paper that's in the peer-reviewed literature that has the title, Carbon Neutrality Should Not Be the End Goal, Lessons for Institutional Climate Action from US Higher Education. And what this paper says is that institutions of higher education as leaders in this space, as training the next generation and as showing what can be done, can refocus climate mitigation efforts towards decarbonization and actions that will help shift policy and markets at larger scales. In other words, decarbonization means actually removing fossil fuel infrastructure and showing how this can be done. And I think we're starting to do that in our plans here. I care less about the exact accounting and saying in 2030 we're being neutral, as much as I care about showing that this is what the transformation of an energy system looks like. And this is what hands-on real projects that think about land use look like. That matters more than the exact number in 2030. So this is really an argument to say, like, carbon neutrality is a great goal because it spurs action, and we've seen that for a lot of people. But we should really be thinking about how do we train our students and how do we show leadership on this climate problem in a way that works for everyone. Climate's really politically contentious. It's hard to navigate that. And some of the solutions I put forward here are solutions that are also politically tough to navigate. So let's train our students to navigate those conversations, right? To think about what are the ways that we can electrify in a way that works for everyone, because electric vehicles right now are not affordable for lots of people, and charging infrastructure is not available to lots of people, and it won't be in the future. So we need to be having those conversations around those justice issues as well. The mining associated with lithium and cobalt batteries is significant in terms of its impacts environmentally and in terms of its human rights implications globally. So this is really a call for a more holistic view of we're training students to be leaders in addressing the climate problem through the work that we're doing on campus in a more holistic sense. Right. Lastly, this is giving it too short shrift, but I want everyone to be aware of it. Carbon is not our only commitment. I just articulated all the things we're doing about this in the ways it's involving students in different ways. But the board has also made a 90% waste reduction by 2030 commitment. And this is about our solid waste that's sent to landfills, much of it food waste. And students have been incredibly involved in taking food that's unused and donating it, something called the Harvest Program, in reducing our waste in our dining halls through a whole series of different sustainability programs. Now, we know our emissions in 2007 as a baseline. So last year, two of the students I worked with really closely spent the whole year trying to figure out if we could figure out our 2007 baseline for the amount of waste that was sent to the landfill. Because you're thinking about trucks and average trucks, and we're doing a lot of math and assumptions around this. So if you're interested in sustainability at Hamilton, you're going to see a lot more around the waste reduction initiatives, trying to reduce plastic usage and single-use plastics and reduce our waste reduction, which is another part of our sustainability initiatives. So I just want everyone to be aware of that. With that, thank you for being here. Love to take questions. I recognize it's at the hour. There's also a farmer's market that some of our sustainability students are hosting on campus over in Thyself. So for those of you who are here for the Parents Weekend, or those of you who are here for the Arboretum talk, and you want to talk to some students who are working on that, that's a cool thing to go check out. Thanks so much for being here, and I'm happy to have a discussion. Yes.
Awesome wetlands. Dark side of the fence. And I wonder if there's other thoughts about other types of rewilding or whatever label you want to put on it as another category of sustainability. It seems to be another way that colleges could be by showing people that you can have real nature and
Thanks so much for that. I didn't talk about it, but it very much is in our land and forest stewardship plan. We have a series of pollinator gardens, areas that were formerly lawn that have been replanted with to attract pollinators and to have a more diverse ecosystem. We also have a wetland protection and advertisement initiative. There are these signs that you'll see by some of these wetlands on campus that try to flag and explain why we have chosen to protect and rewild those areas. We also have areas of low mow and no mow. So not necessarily planting pollinator habitat, but saying we don't need to mow this lawn over here. We can let it go into a more wild state. That's also getting started. So it's very much part of the plan. But one of the great things has been actually working with admissions so that these areas on campus are in the main campus. We call this our Green Attributes Initiative, which has been heavily driven by students. And everything I talked about is in the forested sector, which is outside of the main campus. The Green Attributes Initiative is about our natural systems inside the core campus, just to kind of make a distinction between those spaces. And so if you look at the Land and Forest Stewardship Plan, there's a whole series of things on doing that. Part of that has been administrative, trying to coordinate between buildings and grounds, admissions and the administration, and students in the sustainability office of like, is everyone and athletics, right? Is everyone on the same page about what this place is going to look like, right? Because facilities would come and like mow down all of our cattails and we'd be like, no, don't mow down the cattails. And that has worked incredibly well. There's a student who led all of that for 2 years, who's now a PhD student at UC Santa Cruz, Ellie Sangri, and she like single-handedly got the entire college moving in the same direction on this, which is absolutely incredible. Yeah, thanks.
Can you just talk quickly about use or non-use of solar panels, either on buildings or like, you know, on covered ground?
Absolutely. For the 2 or 3 of you who are at the talk I gave in Utica on Wednesday night, you know, I have lots of thoughts about it. Thanks for being here. In 2017, there was a plan to work with a company to put it in a solar farm over here in the blue, like 1-2 kind of area over there. There was a power purchase agreement that was drawn up. Everyone was ready to go. And then the company started changing the cents per kilowatt hour price. And then it became less clear that we would actually own all of the green attributes from this and that they maybe were selling the REC somewhere else. It left a sour taste with our finance office, and then the company kind of abandoned it and it just fell apart. So we had done a lot of planning around this and it was almost ready to go. For those of you who know how institutions work, if you have a big flop, you don't usually come back to that big flop the next year, right? We are coming back to that now. So the simple answer is, and I don't want to advertise a lot around this, is that we are in conversations about what this would look like that are very substantive and very real with things like maps and numbers. That said, solar around here has also become a very politically fraught and contentious issue in terms of and seen by a lot of people in the community as a land grab that doesn't involve community consultation. I'm happy to talk about that. I have a 5-year NSF research project just on that question, so I'm really excited about it. I'm working on it a lot. There was a conversation when we built the climate action plan about whether we should really lead on the scope 2. And I think the decision was made of like, let's put our eggs in the scope 1, knowing that New York State over the next 15 years is greening rapidly. And if we want to show leadership, let's do it in a way that's educationally beneficial. So thinking about, you know, things like agrivoltaics or how do you navigate putting up a solar farm in a way that, you know, sort of works for the community issues, et cetera. That's where our conversation is now, because we're aware those scope 2s are going to go down naturally, but unless we do something in our building, scope 1s won't. Right, Chuck?
You answered my question about agrivoltaics. I was wondering whether you've investigated that, because aside from the other concerns, that concern of taking potentially prime agricultural and mixing the agriculture with voltaics is great. I really wanted to acknowledge the Hamilton College soccer team, who saved our microforest, which is I'm with Rotary, and we planted a microforest at the intersection of Route 5 and Route 12 at the Veterans Memorial Park. And we had mechanical breakdowns, but the Hamilton College soccer team, the men's soccer team
Yeah.
was there. They created a wheelbarrow brigade and distributed the mulch that was needed to cover the cardboard when we were doing the planting beds presentation. Currently, we're going through ready to go through our first winter. All the plants are doing great. We have no tubes. We're hoping that the traffic pattern will protect us from the deer.
Yeah.
But it's yet to see. So.
Yeah.
Also, at Griffiths Air Force Base, they have a rewilding, naturalization, reforestation process initiative. Have you worked with them at all?
Not in detail, more on when they switched to burning biomass. So in their boiler, but
I'd love
I'll
to make
check it
the
out.
connection between the two, where we
Yeah.
have a microforest and a pollinator garden
Cool.
as part of a new nature trail.
Thanks for that. That's okay. Yeah. Go ahead.
I just wanted to ask about other sources and just to reduce the land use, the enormous land use for solar cells. With other building and solar building, it's like targeting window frames and function.
Yeah. So there's a lot of things you can do with solar, like within building construction.
This perspective into future planning.
That perspective is included in how we think about building management as a whole and how we want to manage our buildings. I didn't talk about it, but this building that you're in now is about 25% of the greenhouse gas footprint of the college, this one building, because science is energy intensive in general. And we have a new contract out to actually change our settings in building management and our lighting. It uses passive solar, right? Like how we've designed this building. But we're actually going to reduce our overall greenhouse gas emissions by 9%, the whole college by 9%. Because of the big whack out of this building's greenhouse gas emissions that we can take by changing how we manage air and lighting and heating in this building. This building does have a geothermal system for part of it, for like the front walk, but not for the rest of it. So this is an exciting new thing. But to your point, in the planning process, we work closely with sort of design and architects to think about how we're doing each of these buildings to maximize all of our ability to cut emissions. Yeah.
Body part, is that taken into your accounting?
It's not. And the reason for that is with this ACU PCC, the American College and University President's Commitment that was made in 2007, what was set up was a group called Second Nature, which is a nonprofit that administers all of these carbon commitments from every higher education institution in the United States. And they have a series of accounting guidelines. Now, I've been on a working group for the last several years about changing that, because what you're seeing in these emissions accounts is just a small slice of the actual impact of Hamilton. For example, if a student drives a car to campus, it's a residential campus that is not considered commuting emissions, and we don't consider it at all. We also don't consider the emissions associated with all of this stuff that we buy that was needed to produce that, which is the embodied emissions that you're speaking of. All of that. So we are following the guidelines as an institution. As a faculty member who works on carbon accounting and wants to do it better, I am working with the guideline writers to try to write better guidelines, because if we write better guidelines, then all these colleges will change how we write those guidelines, including Hamilton, which institutionally is just going to follow what everyone else does. So that is the strategy on that exact question that I'm taking to try to improve that. And I think it's happening. We have, I have to review, I owe my colleague an email review of these new drafts, but part of it is a series of new commitments that breaks away from just neutrality and looks at things like, do you, that you sort of make a commitment to considered embodied emissions, for example, and then you reduce those. Much. We haven't done those numbers, but I'd like to do that over the next few years. They'd be much higher. And again, this is where do you draw these boundaries over what you're responsible for, right? Like that's the sort of main question here. Yeah.
Go back to this slides that have the phase 1, 2, and 3.
Yep.
Where it shows electricity.
Oh,
Versus the.
this, yeah.
So is Hamilton actually through these years using that much, and scope 2, that much less electricity? Is that what it's saying?
No. No. So we're using about the same amount of electricity, but the amount of emissions associated with that electricity has gone down
You're
because,
using it for talking to them.
yeah. So this looks like we're doing a lot, but it's actually that New York is getting rid of coal, you know, doesn't have coal-fired power plants, is putting more renewables on, is, you know, so it's just New York State's grid. That looks like we're doing it. Yeah.
What happened in 2012?
Yeah. That was before my time here. I think it was weather related, but I'm not 100% sure, just in terms of the coolness of the winter. These things are typical. There was a big change in the grid in 2012, which is why you see the green bar drop. Oh no, but there is 1,000-ton drop in scope 1 emissions in that 1 year. And my understanding, I was not here then, but my understanding, and the current facilities managers and other people were also not here then. But my understanding is that that was related primarily to weather, but it might have also been a building. I don't know. I don't have a good answer. Sure.
Who controls what the trees are?
Out, you mean out here?
Yeah, all of the general campus.
There's we have building and grounds manager under the facilities management. And they're the ones that are maintaining our grounds. And there's a campus master plan for the core campus that dictates sort of how it's maintained. And then they make decisions to implement that. But the cutting here that you just saw is associated with the new building that's being built as part of the plans for them.
Is he cutting in areas?
A lot of that has, so there's been some cutting around. Yeah, that was they like let the sustainability group know about that other cutting. It was a combination of safety related fears about things that were going to fall, and there might have been some ashes that were removed because of EAB, emerald ash borer. And I don't know the details of that. I got the emails, but I didn't pay close attention to them. But they're through facilities management is working to decide about some of those maintenance components. Are you concerned about the overcutting of those trees? Yeah. Yep.
I see a perfectly good tree.
Yep. Yep. Yeah.
The tree tubes, how long do they normally last?
3 to 5 years, depends how quickly they grow. One of the things I glossed over here, but that's a concern, is that the trees, that's kind of like the tubes are kind of like helicopter parents, right? They kind of make the tree a little bit less able to stand on its own. So when the tube is removed, the tree's a little weak because it's never been exposed to wind, and it's floppy. And so the first removals in tract 11, I think, will be next year. And we're starting to do that because that's the plan, is to recycle it. But our hope is that some of them are not damaged enough that we can just, yeah, the even better thing than recycling, reuse them. So most of them are in pretty good shape. And that in our upcoming committee meetings is on the docket for thinking about next year.
Fabric or on fabric, if it just needed like around each tree.
Yeah, it's about competition and trying to help the tree, those weed mats. We think that they've been helpful because otherwise you're just competing with all of it becomes a meadow and all the grasses there. What's going to be great is when the canopy, and you can start to see this in tract 11 in parts of it, when it's starting to look like a canopy that's emergent, and you're having 10-foot tall.
It's taken out the tree tube.
Yeah, that gets taken out when the tree tube gets taken out. But then the idea is then the competition is going to go down because you're shading out the meadow. Thank you all for for joining and coming. I really appreciate it. All right. Have a wonderful rest of your final day of summer.